trying to manage two massive egos and two great drivers. It's tough, but at the end of the day, you want to control the pack.
I think then the big question mark is, who do they make way for Verstappen? Hamilton doesn't have the years he's ages working against him. He doesn't have the time to wait on a 4, 5, 6 year project at Ferrari. So he kind of needs them to deliver now.
Hello everybody and welcome to the Crash Formula 1 podcast. After a somewhat static silly season heading into 2026, we're likely to see some huge driver lineup shakeups in the coming year. Will Lewis Hamilton stick with Ferrari or F1 altogether if they struggle next year? Can Kimi Antonelli secure a long-term position at Mercedes? And what are Max Verstappen's options should Red Bull fail to deliver a competitive package? Well, joining me to discuss the movements in the driver market are Lewis Larkham and Jordan Moreland. Jordan, I'll come to you first. I mean, you typically cover MotoGP. How does the kind of F1 driver market landscape kind of compare when you're covering that as opposed to the MotoGP rider landscape?
It's actually a really good question. They're similar and they're not similar. It's MotoGP, when it happens, is done within, I'd say, a month. It's so frenetic. It's like almost like a transfer deadline day. Like the last one we had was in 2024, and it was really revolved around Marc Marquez and Jorge Martin, who were fighting for the factory Ducati seat, and everything kind of stemmed then from that. That affected essentially, I'd say, 4 riders really, and a drop down. It's kind of like that, but F1 I always find it's a lot more dramatically put out there. It's like bravado about where am I going to go, who's going to go where. That's the only thing that's different. But yeah, they're quite similar in the sense of the timelines. Actually, it'll be similar for MotoGP in 26 and into 27. So yeah, we're going to have some crazy moves on both sides of both sports.
Yeah, you're going to be a busy man, Jordan. Looks like it for
absolutely.
Next year anyway, so, which you love. Lewis, let's chat about kind of the current landscape. Obviously, this year we had an insane, silly season prior to this, obviously, with Lewis Hamilton's blockbuster move. And as Jordan touched on, there is these big, huge announcements with these one drivers that have this kind of knock-on effect with Lewis Hamilton. But I mean, this year it's been very static. There's been obviously a few new drivers to the grid. A few people have dropped out, but nothing really unexpected. But I mean, 2027, I think that you mentioned before we started the podcast, a lot of this hinges on the likes of maybe someone like Fernando Alonso heading into 2027.
Yeah, every so often in F1 you get these huge moves that no one sort of saw coming, and obviously we had that last year with Hamilton's move to Ferrari, and although it had been sort of talked about and murmured in the past, it never seemed like a reality. So that nobody saw that coming. It was a huge shock move, and it obviously had repercussions throughout the grids for that year. But then, yeah, going into 2025 was obviously quite a static year going into 26. I think a lot of that was down to the fact that, we're coming to the end of a regulation cycle, and teams want stability and continuity going into 2026 when new regulations come into play, and no one knows what the cars are going to be like and who's going to be where in terms of the competitive order. So I think there's an element of teams favouring that stability and continuity into that new rules reset. But then, as often happens, every sort of 3-4 years or so, there tends to be a period where all of the contracts seem to kind of align in terms of when they end, and there's a lot that end at the end of 2026. I think we've got nearly half the grid out of contracts going into 2027. So naturally, there's a big shake-up that could happen in terms of the driver market, and a lot of that will hinge on who's competitive. And as you said, there are kind of a few key players, as I see it, in the market who will be those kind of key dominoes that will have a knock-on effect for the rest of the grid, and the rest of the market will probably be determined by those. And I think those guys are, as you said, Fernando Alonso, and also I think Max Verstappen. A lot hinges on what he decides to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you said, there's almost this kind of two-pronged element to it where a lot of drivers out of contract at the end of next year, but then the added element of we have a whole new rule cycle next year, whole new regulation cycle, which F1 obviously talked us through some of the new rules yesterday, which we could have done a whole podcast on itself, but it's going to be such a different sport next year, essentially, and that will allow drivers to then really make decisions on what they do from there. Well, maybe let's start with, I mean, I guess potentially, let's start with the world champion, the former world champion, Max Verstappen. He's missed out on his championship this year. He seems content with Red Bull for now. But I mean, ultimately, someone who we could say is still probably the best driver on the grid. You know, 4 world championships he seems happy with, but he happily would have taken a 5th this year, and we know that he will take 5 and beyond heading into next year. And I think he'll be hungry for a championship next year, but big question mark around Red Bull, their performance, things like that. Jordan, do you think that Max will, how long will he hang on in Red Bull, and does he want to hang on to the sport, and where will he be looking, beyond Red Bull if they fail to deliver next year?
Yeah, I mean, funny enough, I actually read something about Red Bull on their 26 engine, and probably reliability is going to be a bit of a struggle for the first part of the season, and then that's also coincides with driver market, doesn't it? They want to get things done earlier and as quickly as possible, and say Mercedes come out the blocks absolutely steaming with their car, and Red Bull are having a shocker, I'd say they'd be all over Max Verstappen. And I think, not that he's going to just abandon Red Bull in that sense, but yeah, I think it would probably sway him towards looking somewhere else. And I think Mercedes or Aston Martin potentially would be the two spots. I can't see him going near Ferrari personally, just because I just can't see him doing that. I think Mercedes would throw the absolute kitchen sink at him to get him. And yeah, same for Aston Martin, but it's all to do with how the first few months of the season really goes, because like I say, Red Bull, unless they have something that's really solid, I can't see him staying there.
Yeah, Lewis, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this as well. I mean, you've discussed the likes of Aston Martin maybe eyeing him up in the past, and as you said, a lot of this hinges on what I think we could say what Fernando Alonso does, but also potentially what happens to him as well, because you would imagine that Aston Martin would want to hold on to him beyond 2026 because he is still driving at a very strong level, but I don't think that's a guarantee either. I think they could also part ways with him as well and just say, look, we need to make room for the future. What do you see as Verstappen's kind of approach heading into 26 and also Aston Martin's kind of, I mean, I think that's kind of a bit of the obvious one there with Aston Martin there. There's 2 potentially huge moves that could happen there.
Yeah, so Verstappen, just firstly, he obviously has a long-term contract with Red Bull. He's contracted till the end of 2028. As we kind of know in F1, the contracts are not usually worth they're written on, and a lot of things can change. There are a lot of performance clauses and get-out clauses in these kind of things, and we know that Verstappen has those performance exit clauses in his contract. One which wasn't activated last season, crucially, because he remained in the top 3 of the championship at the time. But we don't know the exact details of these clauses, but we believe they're performance related, and therefore an option could exist for Verstappen to leave Red Bull if they're not competitive enough. I think there's really 2 aspects to this from Verstappen's side. I think in an ideal world, he'd just like to continue with Red Bull and continue to Red Bull. He said that after his first, let's just do this forever. Like, I want to. He is so embedded within the team. I think if he could have everything his own way, he'd just choose to stay there and continue winning. The big unknown is the performance side of things, and we just don't know how competitive Red Bull are going to be next year. Lots of rumours, lots of talk, but until the action really starts, we just won't know where anyone stands, really, not just Red Bull. There's obviously the big question marks over there. In-house power unit that they designed for the first time, how that will stack up, whether it's reliable, whether the performance is there. So this is one key element to it. Clearly, Verstappen will go where there's a competitive chance of winning not only races, but championships. So that's one massive aspect. That is going to be a talking point for several months early in the season. I imagine the early months of the season will be dominated by this talk.
Yeah.
Because it will be not only who is competitive, but then if Red Bull aren't competitive, we're going to get all these rumours starting again about Verstappen's future. I think the other aspect to this is, does Verstappen even enjoy driving these cars? Because this is the other thing for Verstappen now. And we saw with how relaxed he was at the end of last season that he he obviously does care about winning titles, but he's kind of giving off this sense that he doesn't, and that he's just there because purely for the passion of racing and for he wants to win, of course, in F1, but he's there because he loves doing it. And there's a big question mark over how the cars will be next year. It's a completely different ball game with all the new modes we've got, and whether Verstappen will enjoy that. There's been a few suggestions that the new cars will actually suit the drivers who do a lot of sim racing and on that side of things, which we know Verstappen is also very passionate about. So maybe he will love driving them, and then it will be a case of, okay, he's going to stay in F1, and then it's a case of where does he end up in F1? Or does he quit F1 altogether because he just doesn't get on with these cars, he doesn't enjoy it, maybe Red Bull aren't competitive, and then we know he already wants to go down the sports car route. He's already he's already made his debut and won in sports cars. So perhaps maybe leaving F1 altogether is not beyond the realms of possibility. He's hinted at this in the past, and perhaps he could make a full-time switch to sports cars or WEC. He's even been testing Mercedes this week at Estoril in Portugal. So clearly he's made it clear that passion is something he wants to delve into in the future, and that could be something that's brought forward if he doesn't like the cars and if Red Bull aren't competitive. But ultimately, if he wants to stay in F1 and Red Bull aren't competitive, then you start to look at who is the most competitive. As we say, we've kind of everyone's tipping Mercedes to be the favourite, and they're probably the smart, obvious choice given their history in the sport and history with new regulation cycles. So I think, and Toto Wolff has publicly admitted that he wants to sign Max Verstappen and will do if that opportunity arises, even with kind of putting his faith in Kimi Antonelli and George Russell. He won't rule out a move for Max Verstappen, and he'd be stupid to if Verstappen made himself available or became available. He would be the first pick for, I think, every team on the grid. So I think Mercedes have to come into that as an option for Verstappen, and particularly if they do hit the ground running and they are the team to beat. I think that move would make sense for him. And then there's the Aston Martin question too. There's been a lot of talk that they would be interested in signing Verstappen, and obviously there's the Adrian Newey connection there. That was something that would appeal to Max. But again, I think the biggest question mark with Aston Martin is they would have to really hit the ground running next year, and we just don't know that. There's a lot of talk that obviously Newey's a genius and won championships at every team he's been at. So I think a lot there hinges on how competitive the Aston Martin is. And if they are winning races and fighting for the title next year and pull off something remarkable, then that would probably sway Verstappen. But if they're still kind of proving themselves, I'm not sure he'd leave Red Bull to join this kind of unknown project that hasn't got a guarantee of winning races and championships, particularly if Red Bull are there or thereabouts. That's kind of the way I'm seeing it at the moment. I agree with Jordan. I can't see him making that switch to Ferrari, particularly if they're kind of still in no man's land next year. I think he hasn't ruled out a move to Ferrari, but again, I think to move to Ferrari they would have to be winning, and if they're winning, their drivers probably stay in place. So I think it's either there's several options. I think it's either we're looking at Verstappen staying at Red Bull, we're looking at him switching to Mercedes or Aston Martin, or potentially walking away from the sport altogether. So there's a huge amount of options there that could become reality, and obviously they would have big repercussions up and down the grid.
Yeah, it's a level of power he has, Jordan, at this point in his career, isn't it? I mean, the cards are all in his hands. He can really do whatever he wants. And it's funny saying this as someone who is the vice champion of this year. You wouldn't particularly think that they should have this power, but everyone's walking away from the last season saying, look at how he drove that season. He is undoubtedly the best on the grid at the moment right now. Interestingly, just back onto Aston Martin, just to stick with that for a minute, we have said in the past, Jordan, that they have all the money in the world, and they're certainly spending it, but are they still this I think right now they're quite an attractive option, but how long can they hold on to that kind of title for a while? I mean, even Alonso, who is kind of at the end of his career, could kind of say, well, look, I'm fed up. I'm just not in the mood for driving around a P7, P8, P9 car again for another year. I mean, not that he's always been very open about how he likes to pull out really, decent results from a difficult car. But ultimately, he wants to be back to. We saw what 23 was like with him. So,
Yeah.
I mean, they've got all this money, but do you think that they will be an attractive option, heading into next year, even if they underperform? Are the makings still there for them to turn it around?
Yeah, they have yeah, I suppose it's the image, isn't it? The brand, the new factory, the everything. That's what kind of would entice people. And to going back to Verstappen and linking it with Aston, I do think that I did say it could go early, this market, but Verstappen could also do the flip side, and he could drag it as long as he wanted. I think he has that much say in where he wants to go, and I think that's something that needs to be hinted at too. I mean, we could get to September, and he could still not have made his mind up. And I think that would be brilliant for everybody that wants to be interested. But yeah, Aston Martin, I think that would be the only aspect where he could look at it. He'd give it time to see how the project's going, and if it's where it is now, essentially from the 25 season, I think you'd be like, no, it's not worth it. But yeah, if you factored in Aston purely for the money and you get to work with Adrian Newey again, yeah, great. But yeah, I don't know. I think that it just screams Mercedes, doesn't it? You can't shake off those rumors from last year and those talks with Toto Wolff. I think that's the only place I can see him going, other than staying at Red Bull, or as Lewis says, just walking away completely.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, let's get on to Mercedes then. I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, they've got a really solid driver lineup, Lewis, this year. Kimi Antonelli, his first year in F1, he seemed to impress, and obviously he's been touted as this kind of potential long-term project for Mercedes, but they've not committed to him long-term yet. And then they also have, we've mentioned in the past, one of the strongest drivers on the grid with George Russell. Again, someone they've not necessarily committed long-term to him relative to the other team's commitments with the likes of McLaren and Ferrari as well. But I mean, this is clearly a bit of a sign that Mercedes would still like to keep the door open to Verstappen. But ultimately, them as a race team, what does their lineup look like? I think beyond 26 is going to be really, really interesting. Do you think that one? I think the question is, can Kimi consolidate his position there? But actually, can George consolidate a position there long term? We know that he kind of wants to be there long term. I'm sure he'd be happy in any race winning team at the end of the day. But he likes the outfit of Mercedes. He's been part of the junior team for so long as well. What is the outlook for that team? I think it's actually there's a lot of options for Mercedes there.
There are, and I think ultimately you're right. I think they are leaving the door fully open for that possibility of Max Verstappen walking through, and I think that's kind of the dream scenario, that they're in a competitive position and they can lure Verstappen away from Red Bull and get that dream driver that Toto wants, and that kind of dream combination for the next 4 or 5 years in this rule cycle. I think then the big question mark is, who do they make way for Verstappen? And that's the trickiest decision Mercedes would have to make if Verstappen were available and keen to join them, because George Russell was one of the standout drivers in 2025. Arguably top 3-4 on the grid, and as impressive as the likes of Verstappen, Norris and Piastri at times, and really kind of solidified his place, I think, as like the team leader at Mercedes, and has shown exactly what he can do. The big question mark over Russell is obviously we just haven't seen him in a title fight yet, and whether that extra pressure would affect him in any way. The other aspect of this is pairing up Verstappen and Russell would be quite a blockbuster lineup, and we not only because they've had their own sort of beef on track towards the end of 2024, but also just because of how good they both are, how competitive they are, and how hungry they are to succeed. And we know how ruthless Max Verstappen is, and I think George Russell would be equally if he got into a potentially title-winning car. He wants it badly, and he wants it with Mercedes. And yeah, he would love to take it to Verstappen. I'm sure that prospect wouldn't faze him, but it would give Mercedes a particularly awkward scenario. We could be looking at that kind of dynamic they had to manage with Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg for several years, where you've got sort of two alpha drivers battling it out for world championships, even in a dominant car as it was at the time. And I think that's the big question mark. Would Mercedes want to would Toto Wolff particularly want to deal with that stress again, having probably taken aged him a few years during that period, and he's had the kind of nice harmonious relationships with Russell and Hamilton, and it never really got too tense between them because they weren't in a hugely competitive car. And then now you've got the Russell Antonelli dynamic, which is very friendly, very, it's working well at the moment, and you've got that aspect of kind of Russell almost acting as Antonelli's mentor in that.
Yeah, it's very brotherly, isn't it?
In a way, sort of big brother, little brother kind of aspect at the moment, but that's at the moment, and we don't know how. Antonelli's got such a high ceiling that he could, end up taking it to George Russell in the next few years, and they could end up having that kind of, I say, luxury problem. They could have that as it is with their current lineup in a few years down the line. So I think that's the biggest thing from Mercedes' side is who do they want to pair Verstappen with, and how they make that call, because then they've put a lot into both of their drivers, both Russell and Antonelli. They brought through from a young age. They've nurtured them through their junior programs, placed them in F1 and given them that chance. And Toto Wolff's alluded to it several times that is their kind of their lineup for the future. That's what they want in an ideal world. But you can't rule out Max Verstappen if that opportunity comes about. And then it's a very difficult call to make. And you've got to say that would be based on the form next year. As we don't know, we don't know how long this could drag on for. If it's early on in the season, that makes it even more difficult. If Verstappen, if Red Bull's absolute disaster, they're nowhere, they're at the back of the grid, Verstappen wants out, 3-4 races in, and we've not had time to see how Antonelli and Russell are really shaping up against each other, but Verstappen's there to be taken, that would be a very difficult situation and decision for Mercedes to make. Whereas if it dragged on till the end of the season, I guess you look at the performance of Russell and Antonelli and you judge it on that and who's having the better season. And I guess you make that call based on that. And we've only got 2025 to go off. And obviously Russell, had the better of Antonelli quite comfortably, but it was Antonelli's first season. It was a learning season. He started off well, had a really tricky period, particularly during that European stretch. It was a bit of a disaster, but he managed to turn it around and kind of show signs of what he's capable of, and maturity as well. Let's not forget he's only 19, and he managed to turn that around with all that pressure, with all that spotlight on him. Okay, less so than kind of in the Red Bull environment, let's say. Mercedes have been very supportive, but then again, Toto Wolff was also criticising Antonelli vocally at his home race at one point. So, 2026 there'll be less hiding place for Antonelli because it will be his second season in F1. Mercedes could be right up there fighting for world championships potentially. So if he slips up, then the pressure will be on, and we'll be talking about can he hold his seat for the future. I think, ultimately Mercedes would have a very difficult decision to make if Verstappen is there for the taking.
Absolutely. I mean, Jordan, we'd love it, wouldn't we? George Russell and Max Verstappen, it would be the best thing ever, wouldn't it, for the sport?
It'd be amazing. I'm a bit more cynical in the sense that Antonelli, for me, needs to come out and win straight away next year, personally, if he wants to validate his seat. And that, of course, goes in if the car's good. If the car's good, there's no hiding place, as Lewis says. And I just can't understand, and I couldn't understand it this year, why they weren't committing to George Russell. I'm like, this guy, he still has the future too. He's only 27 at the end of the day, and he's still young, and he's had so much experience in F1. And I think that why would you want to lose someone like that for him to go somewhere else, and say he was to win them with another team? Yeah, you might get him, Max Verstappen, but it's like you could have both of them. That's the way I look at it. You want that aspect of competition, and I think that there's no harm in it. Like, it's a stress for management, of course it is. Trying to manage two massive egos and two great drivers, it's tough, but at the end of the day, you want to control the pack. You want to have the two best in your team, and that to me ultimately means if you have the two best, you drive each other on to new heights, and you get it to a point where it gets dirty. It does. It eventually always gets dirty, but let's be honest, you want to have the control. And Antonelli, it's a real shame, I think, with the time that he's came into F1, because if there was a B spec team for him to go into and learn, that's why this Mercedes project is tough for me to look at. Where it's like you've given essentially as the replacement of Lewis Hamilton, and you're coming in and you expect him to be like just straight on it. That's tough. I feel
maybe they could put him back in it. They could put him.
They could
potentially. There's we know Williams are a customer of Mercedes.
Yeah,
but again, Williams aren't going to want to change their current lineup, so that only is if one of their drivers leaves. Potentially, Antonelli could go to Williams, but that's a bit of a brutal call for Mercedes to make. It's to kind of give him that stopgap. But then again, then maybe he needs that change of.
That's what he would need.
They're an engine supplier for Alpine too, as well. So that's also another option.
This is a good thing about Mercedes. They have options, and it's not nice because they've kind of went the roundabout way where Antonelli really should progress through, and if he has the talent, he'd be in the main team. But it would be a brutal call to get rid of him at such a young age. And you wonder how that would affect him down the road if it's going to have will it break him or will it make him? Essentially, I think that But if Max Verstappen's on the table, I'm not losing George Russell if I'm team boss either. I'm paying the money to keep them both. I want to have Verstappen and Russell just to fight it out, and that would, to me, send a message to McLaren, Ferrari, Red Bull. We're not messing about, sort of thing, and that's what Mercedes need to get back to. They need to get back to being the Mercedes that I've known for the past 10 years, where they're just the best, and they need to have the complete package personally just to do it.
Yeah, they also, it lets you control the narrative in F1 throughout the year when you're in that position. I mean, I actually think McLaren let that slip this year. The story was Verstappen's comeback this year, really. Yeah. Obviously, it was great to watch, Oscar and Lando go toe-to-toe, but everyone was watching Max Verstappen throughout the entirety of that season, whereas it doesn't really compare to, say, the Hamilton and Rosberg years, as you mentioned, Jordan, where, Mercedes, if they had those two drivers, yes, there'd be some fireworks, no doubt, but they would control the narrative in Formula One if they were this dominant team that everyone seems to be building up about their engine this year. So I think that's one to really, really watch, and I think you're right, Jordan. I mean, ultimately, I think Toto Wolff maybe also has maybe a bit more steely determination to put up with two drivers like that, as opposed to maybe Zach Brown. I think Zach Brown enjoyed the harmony that he had with McLaren, and I'm not trying to say that was easy for him to navigate either, but there was times where it almost felt like they were potentially taking the easy route with some of the calls they'd made with their drivers as well. So I think Toto, because he's been through it before, I can't see him not, shying away from that again. Maybe I'm wrong. He is a little bit older now, but Toto has that fire in his belly, doesn't he?
He wants to win, doesn't he? He wants to win regardless. So that's the underlying tone of it.
Especially with how the last few seasons have gone,
absolutely,
ladies, and losing a bit of face in that time, and being made to look a little bit silly as well. Like they've not been from dominating F1 for 7-8 years on the trot to then seemingly not being able to design a car or not being able to get on top of these regulations. They can't wait to make that clean slate. And I agree. Ultimately, if I was boss of Mercedes, I'd be wanting the two best drivers in the car. And, kind of based on last season, that's certainly Verstappen and Russell, I would pair alongside him.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get on to Ferrari now, because I think this is going to be a really big storyline that people are going to watch throughout the year. Lewis, I mean, I think the first person to talk about is obviously Hamilton, but I think we could have a discussion about both their drivers given how bad the last year has gone. Obviously, Lewis has a long-term deal with Ferrari, as does Charles Leclerc. We don't know the exact details of both of those deals, but both of those drivers are locked into that team for quite a long time. Hamilton has had, one of his worst years in recent memories in Formula One with Ferrari. I'm sure he's been one disappointment with the race results, but also potentially just how the transition has gone with Ferrari. It hasn't really felt like he has clicked with that team fully. What do you see as the main priority for 2026? Is it a case where, I mean, ultimately, Ferrari maybe doesn't want to keep Hamilton around given his recent results, but also Hamilton, he's just sick of waiting around, isn't he? And he's sick of not having results. Even with Mercedes, it felt like he was kind of getting sick of the direction of the team there as well. So what's his outlook like heading into 2026, and then what he'll be thinking after those first couple of rounds for 2027?
Yeah, I think 2026, there's no doubt about it, is a make or break year for Ferrari, but also for both their drivers. They're both, Hamilton doesn't have the years that he's, age is working against him. He doesn't have the time to wait on a 4, 5, 6 year project at Ferrari. So he kind of needs them to deliver now. And Charles Leclerc has been waiting patiently for that World Championship winning car from Ferrari, and he's not yet had it. And, he's 27, 28 now, and coming, in the prime of his career and still performing brilliantly. I mean, 2025, despite it being an absolute horror show for Ferrari, kind of underlined just how good Charles Leclerc is again. And, but he's going to be getting sick of kind of turning out these kind of performances to get a podium for Ferrari. He wants to do it with Ferrari. It's his dream. But I think his patience and his loyalty is going to be tested this year. And for Hamilton, I think, again, Ferrari need to be having a championship winning car for him to absolutely stay on. I think if it's a repeat of this year, I struggle to see him continuing, because he's surely only interested in winning, and he's not a driver to just walk away and quit. Like, that's never been Hamilton's style. But I think if his struggles continue, if the car's not good, even if the car is good and he's still underperforming, if it then becomes more of he has to look on himself and think, is it time to call it a day? We don't know. I think that those two questions, I think, will be answered in 2026 ultimately, because either Ferrari have a competitive car and they're both up there, or Hamilton's still struggling. Then it becomes a question of, has he reached that downward point of his career and he needs to consider quitting because he's not quite at that level anymore, or are they competitive and he wants to continue? But if they're not competitive, and they're both kind of equally matched or close enough to each other, then does Hamilton decide just to walk away because he knows he's not going to win in the next 2 or 3 years, and that kind of dream has just faded, because the only other reason to really hang on, if they really are that far off, is for the kind of money side of it, or just because he's still got the passion. But as we've seen this year, I can't remember seeing Lewis Hamilton as low as he was this year, and it was pretty soul destroying at times. It was not enjoyable to watch. It was very hard to watch, just seeing how gutted he was in those interviews and criticizing himself, and kind of almost like kind of self-doubts creeping in, which is something we've never seen with Lewis Hamilton before. I don't think it showed in 2025 he wouldn't enjoy that continuing for 2 years. I think it's not like he's suddenly going to then enjoy driving around in 8th or 9th place. I think it's quite clear that he's only there to win. And so I think, 2026 is huge for Hamilton, and what he decides to do and whether he decides to walk away. And obviously if he did, there's a seat there at Ferrari. But then at the same time, you've also got the Leclerc factor here. And if Ferrari aren't competitive, does he finally say, enough is enough and I need to look after myself here? Because drivers they need to be selfish, and he wants to win a world championship. And if he stays at Ferrari and they continue to fumble for years to come, he will never be a world champion, and he probably deserves to be. I think he's certainly, we need to see him in a title winning car and assess that. But I think he deserves the opportunity to at least have that chance, and we haven't seen it. So then does he think about leaving Ferrari? And I think I touched on it before in a previous podcast, that there's a situation where Ferrari could be looking for 2 new drivers if things go that badly wrong for 2027. Leclerc's the interesting one there, because I think if Hamilton left, I think it's because he's retiring. I don't think teams, but Leclerc would be leaving to join another team. And then where does he go? Potentially, if Verstappen stays at Red Bull, maybe Mercedes is an option. There's been a lot of talk about Aston Martin recently as well. And we know that his manager, Nicholas Todd, has been kind of talking up in recent months that the time has come that he's ready to fight for world championships, and he needs to have a championship winning car, and kind of putting a little bit of pressure on Ferrari there. It's a bit of we've not heard that before, where, previously Leclerc's camp have been very, it's a dream to drive for Ferrari. I want to win titles with Ferrari, but just maybe a sign of little cracks showing there that actually he is beginning to get quite frustrated at this repeated situation year on year. And there's kind of only so much more he can take. And with the driver market potentially being so fluid next year, then he might have to take this opportunity and run. Particularly if Fernando Alonso decides to retire. Again, he is one of the other dominoes in this equation. Does he retire from F1? He's kind of hinted that 2026 could be his last year. Again, a lot will stem on Aston Martin's competitiveness, and I think if he won a third world championship, he'd absolutely just quit there and then. That is his kind of dream scenario. He said it would be harder to retire if the car's not so good, but does he want to just keep, circling around in the midfield for 2 or 3 more years? I don't really see that appealing to him. So I think it's a very a high possibility that Alonso does decide to call time in his career at the end of 2026, and therefore Aston Martin would need that kind of replacement driver for him, a high-profile top-line driver, and Leclerc would certainly fit that bill. So I think that's one to potentially watch as well as the season unfolds.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Jordan, Ferrari are in this kind of weird position, I think, heading into next year, where in the past they've always been able to coax drivers into the team. I mean, even when you look as far back as when they managed to get Kimi Räikkönen back with the team and things like that, throughout the kind of latter Vettel years. And I don't really think they're in that position now heading into the next year. They've got probably one of the best driver lineups on the grid at the moment, which they're not extracting from. Essentially, we can see that from the results. Where do you see Ferrari heading in terms of, are they going to be worrying that their drivers as well could pull the trigger and try to leave the team too? Are they even thinking that way, or are they thinking, no, these two are going to stay here and maybe we'll underdeliver, but we'll eventually get there in the end? It's hard to get into the psychology of that team sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. Because sometimes I think that they don't know what's going on, to be honest. It's terrible saying that, but they clearly do. I mean, they get the sense that Lewis Hamilton's not happy. They get the sense that Leclerc's not happy. And the priority for me, if I was Ferrari, would be keep Leclerc personally. Just try and keep him on side. I know it's really sort of, why would you do that about Lewis Hamilton? But it's, as Lewis points out, it's the age factor. And it's like, has Father Time finally caught up on Lewis Hamilton? Is the decline happening? I don't think it is personally me. I don't think so. Because I think if he was in the Mercedes in 25, I think he'd be fine. I think he'd be kind of doing what he was doing the last season and a half when he was there. But yeah, I don't know. I think Lewis Hamilton, I think his mind is almost nearly made up where he wants to go with this, unless there's a massive turnaround. But then you can't really expect that after how bad it's been. Leclerc, for me, is one they need to just keep sweet. I don't know how they do that. It's like, if you give him a marginally better car, the results will improve. I mean, he'll be in there around the podium, but Lewis says he wants to be a world champion, and he needs to think about himself. And I know that the way it's portrayed, he's the Italian sort of pin-up child for the whole of Italy, isn't he? Really, they put their eggs in his basket as the guy from Monaco who should lead us to the world title. But if the guy's not on board, I mean, you have to let him go eventually. I mean, you can't be holding him back from that. And yeah, I do think if Hamilton would leave, I do think Leclerc would stick around for one more year potentially. Just as sort of like, yeah, it's not going to go to the total pot essentially, but yeah, I don't know how it's going to go there. It could flip either way, really.
And also, who do you sub in then? You know what I mean? Who do you get in?
This is the fun thing, isn't it? So we've mentioned Sainz in the past. I don't know if Carlos Sainz would want to go back there as a sort of, how would that be a hit to him? Being like, yeah, sorry, mate, we made a mistake. I should have just kept you. That I don't know. If you look at younger talent too,
Williams could be in a better position than Ferrari as well.
Exactly, that's it. And why would Sainz want to go back somewhere to like struggle? Do you look at Kimi Antonelli as like the Italian sort of angle? If it all goes there at Mercedes, that could be something.
Antonelli could be an option if he loses his seat at Mercedes, and if Ferrari are kind of desperately seeking a replacement, then he could be a good option. I mean, I'm sure at some point in his F1 career, he would love to drive for Ferrari, and Ferrari would love to have...
You just know that what way that PR campaign would be. It would be like
imagine.
It would be like the Pope coming back with that sort of thing. That's what
that genuinely could be an option. There's also, you can't discount. Again, it all depends on kind of Verstappen, really, I guess. But
it does.
Ferrari could sign potentially George Russell if he was available, or Oscar Piastri, if he was starting to get fed up at McLaren
Yeah.
and the team harmony was dissolving there, and he was starting to feel like a number two, potentially Piastri becomes available.
Yeah.
There's
Ollie Berman too.
Ollie
Ollie
Behrman
Berman's there.
is the obvious one, obviously, as a Ferrari junior, and we kind of believe he's on a sort of a 2-year loan arrangement at Haas, and basically whenever they need a replacement, he will be
He'll
kind
be
of
the
is the
man.
natural successor to Hamilton. So I think if Leclerc goes, I think Behrman would get that. Sorry, if Hamilton goes and Leclerc stays, I think Behrman would get that seat naturally. I think that would be the play that Ferrari would do for 2027.
Yeah.
I think the bigger question, the more difficult thing is then if they lost both drivers, if it was that bad, and then they're not very appealing as a team, other than the history of the team and the fact it's Ferrari. If they're having a horror season or so, then who does Sainz want to join them? Probably not if Williams are outperforming them. And then are you able to bring in somebody like Russell or Piastri? Maybe if they've been forced out, or in case maybe if Verstappen comes in. But yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, ultimately, they kind of were in a similar enough position in the kind of early 2020s when obviously Vettel moved on. They had Leclerc as their golden boy, who was obviously this race-winning driver. When they brought in Sainz, it was probably a little bit of a risk at the time as well. Looking back now, it was one of the best decisions they made because just how well he did in Ferrari. And honestly, up to that point, he'd probably been a little bit underrated. He was really good with McLaren. He was really good with Renault as well. He always impressed. But he wasn't really seen as this kind of, absolute championship winning driver, and I think sometimes maybe he's only being looked that way now, but they have taken those risks in the past when they've kind of had to. Do we see a world though where they have someone like an Ollie Behrman or Kimi Antonelli and go, no, this is our project, this is going to be our race winning driver, and then I don't know, do they get someone like a Gasly in there, like a solid driver that they're able to just sign and put them on a 2-year deal?
You can go back in the history of Ferrari and you look at some of the driver lineups. I'm talking about the 90s. I mean, there was some weird driver pairings before Michael Schumacher. And it's like, are they in this sort of transitional period where people kind of look at it in the sort of short term, like, oh, Ferrari are terrible. But I mean, Ferrari have had some stinking pasts. Like, I mean, runs of 5 to 10 years where they didn't even win a race. And you're like, it's been bad in podiums, and it's like, oh, they're a hard company to nail on and to expect them to be. I think that's what it is. You expect them to be like Mercedes, you expect them to be like Red Bull, but it's just Ferrari, isn't it? It's different. That's the whole thing of it.
It's just the whole thing, exactly. And I think, as you say, Jordan, I mean, it kind of shocks me that we're almost talking about Ferrari in this way because of how tantalizingly close that they had come to the constructors in 24, and it really looked like they were on to go back. And look, maybe I'd love for us to look back in a year's time and look at some of our predictions now and see what happens, and maybe Ferrari will absolutely exceed expectations next year, and we won't be having this conversation whatsoever. They'll have a solid lineup, but it just feels like there could be some big movement there, and Ferrari doesn't have the cards that they used to hold even up to a couple of years ago. But let's get on to another team now real quick. Lewis, I want to chat about Cadillac. They're going to be a really interesting team heading into next year. Obviously, Valtteri Bottas, Sergio Perez returning to the grid, a safe pair of hands. I think that, honestly, heading into 27, the lineup will probably be static there as well. But just as a team prospect, I think they're an interesting one to look out for because ultimately they are going to want to think down the line and think long term and think about getting someone younger in there to take on the mantle. So while they've got these two really solid Grand Prix drivers that will help build the team and educate the team, and really both of them are race winners, they both raced for two of the biggest teams and two championship winning teams. So they are the perfect combination. But ultimately, Bottas and Perez aren't going to be on the grid for forever, and Cadillac will want to have a bit of a project, I think, heading forward. And is there any kind of prospects they should be looking towards?
Yeah, I think they've absolutely nailed their driver lineup choice for next year, because obviously they're going to be a huge question mark in terms of where they are. Well, we're probably not expecting miracles from them in their first season in F1, but if they are competitive, if they are able to fight in the points or whatever, they've got two drivers that will absolutely be there and will maximise every opportunity they get, and they've got that experience behind them. Also, if they're struggling, they've got two drivers again with the experience to help develop the team in the right direction. It'll be an interesting one to see how that plays out, because they're both on long-term deals. But as you say, that they're not getting any younger, and they will have to look to the future at some point. I think I think one of them, I think one aspect here is Colton Herta. No,
Of course.
Haas won. Not Haas, sorry, Cadillac. The other American team, Cadillac, have made it clear that they'd like an American driver at some point in F1, and they've signed Holter as their kind of sort of test.
Yes, and obviously he's starting in Formula 2 this year as well. So.
Yeah, so he's making the switch to Formula 2, which is a bit of a strange move and a bit of a shock move in some ways, because he's been doing very well in IndyCar, multiple time race winner out there, and forging a very solid career for himself out in America. He's doing F2 next year with High Tech, and the aim there is to get enough super license points so that he could make the step up to F1. So I think that's one to watch next year. And, you know, if he comes in F2 and absolutely blitzes it and wins the championship or something, or is top 2 or 3, gets the super license points he wants, that would probably force Cadillac's hand to bring him in. And I think ultimately that would be, they would like to do that, whether it's in a year or two's time. I think they would like to have an American driver if possible. So I think that probably makes sense in the short to mid-term. I guess it's just a question of how quickly that happens and that situation develops. And that's kind of down to how well Herta does in F2 next season. Because, if he exceeds expectations and wins a championship or something and can't stay on for 2027, then Cadillac would kind of have to promote him. And then it's a case of who did they get rid of out of Bottas and Perez, which is probably down to who performs better in 2026. But I would be inclined to think that maybe Bottas would move on in that situation, and that, you know, I think Perez with his backing as well, I think, you know, that's attractive for
North American lineup is ultimately what you could end up with.
I think you know, that could be an option, that you potentially look at a Perez Colton Herta lineup, or maybe there's another young driver that we're perhaps not aware of yet, or who is going to take F2 by storm next season, and they might become an option. But I think if there isn't that standout sort of choice, I think Cadillac are probably set for the next 2 or 3 years at least before they really need to start thinking about replacements. And particularly if they have a bit of a slow start to life in F1 and they're kind of fighting towards the back to start with and steadily building themselves up, there's less time pressure there. Plus, they have 2 drivers that are going to win races if their car's good enough to. So they kind of don't really need to do anything. I think it's more a case of whether Herta proves himself, gets the super license points, and is ready to make the jump up to F1, and they decide they do want to field that American in their team, which I'm sure they would love to.
Yeah, absolutely. Another F2 driver I want to talk about, Jordan, is of course Alex Dunn, who looked almost tantalizingly close to heading into F1 this year. Obviously, he had an impressive year in his rookie year in F2, although I think there was definitely some races where he looked a little bit rough around the edges. He was involved in a few kind of, you know, rookie collisions, but ultimately I think he was a very strong driver, and I think he would have finished higher in the standings were it not for some unfortunate penalties, things like that throughout the season. But of course, he was with the McLaren driver development program, parted ways with them, basically because it was understood that Helmut Marko had approached him to get him on board with Red Bull, and that's all been blown to pieces now, and Dunn is back in F2 again for another year. A little bit of whispers of maybe looking at some other teams from now, but nothing's really been officially announced. I mean, Cadillac was one I think that people maybe thought would have approached him for even a development role or something like that. But I mean, do you see a prospect for Dunn to kind of recover from this and try and get onto the grid? We know how fast the market moves with young talent coming up throughout the years.
Yeah, it's interesting with Alex. I think, I mean, it was no surprise really whenever she left McLaren. It was like, well, there's something clearly down the line here, and then obviously to say all this Red Bull stuff's a bit unfortunate. Where he can go, I think he's kind of got a good option. I mean, he's a good driver, and these sort of newer teams that are going through transitions, you can easily pick yourself up a seat there, I think.
True.
I was reading that Alpine were also kind of sniffing around, and yeah, it's not as attractive, but you could get yourself an F1 driver if you play your cards right.
And I think they'll be better they'll be more attractive next year than they have been over the last 5 years.
Because the Mercedes engines helps, doesn't it, massively? I think Dunn's in it doesn't seem like it, but he's in a good position because he now has full foresight of what the market's like,
Yeah.
and you can position yourself into these teams. And another factor, he's not going to cost as much as some drivers,
Yeah.
and teams are really aware of that with cost. And I think that if they see you perform in F2 and they know you're good and they can get you at a cheap price, they'll take the punt on you. I think that's the key thing.
I mean, Alpine have to be better next year. I mean, they can't really,
of course, yeah.
lower down the pecking order. And with Mercedes coming on board, they will at least have the power unit side of things sorted. And yeah, there's talk that he's holding negotiations with them about a potential role or development role for a future F1 seat. And I think a lot of it will obviously depend on how he gets on in his second season in F2. But the other aspect to this is that Franco Colapinto's future is very much not secure. He kind of kept the seat for next year by virtue of there not really being a standout to sort of replace him. And he kind of recovered a bit in the second half of the season and done a okayish job alongside Gasly. It wasn't amazing. He didn't score any points, but he improved enough for them to think, okay, we'll keep him for 2026, but I think they'll very much assess their options for 2027. Gasly's on a long-term deal, I think, to at least the end of 2028. So I don't see him going anywhere, but really that second seat will be an option. And that's where, if Colapinto doesn't perform next season, particularly in his second full season, then I think there'll be a lot of pressure on that seat. And if Dunn is doing a good job in F2, there's potentially a pathway there to an F1 seat with Alpine. Maybe even somebody like Yuki Tsunoda as well could potentially find a landing spot back at a team like Alpine. He's obviously been teammates with Gasly before and has a great relationship with him. I think Alpine are one who will be potentially looking for a new driver in 2027. And that's where maybe a young driver could come in. And there's Leo Fornarelli as well, the reigning F2 champion, who's actually signed to McLaren's young driver books. But I think it's very hard to see how you get in there, and that's that's ultimately why Dunn left the program, because they've kind of got Piastri and Norris locked down. Unless something unforeseen happens there's no real route in at McLaren. So maybe at Alpine are a place where a young, exciting talent could slot in for 2027, and Dunn absolutely could be a contender for that seat.
Yeah, he kind of already
sorry, Ian. I think we'll actually see a bit of movement there with the reserve development drivers, because you've got Crawford and stuff. He's at Aston Martin, isn't he? Yeah. I think he could be a real player as well, because especially the nationality, that's a massive thing to look at. Those sort of Haas, Cadillac. I could see someone like him being potentially moved around too.
And there is a big push to get more Americans on the grid. I mean, the sport has become huge over there, and I mean, I think that Haas, I've always missed this opportunity to become the de facto American team on the grid. Cadillac are now going to be seen as this North American kind of outfit. And honestly, I think even the way they've approached entering Formula One has really impressed me. As you say, Lewis, the way they went about picking the lineup, it was just pure logic. And I think it's just been the smartest thing for them to do. And I mean, ultimately, that will be a factor too of trying to get.
Maybe Haas have that opportunity to get an American driver in 2027, because, they potentially. I think Esteban Ocon's probably pretty secure there for the next couple of years. Yeah. But Ollie Behrman, there's obviously big question marks over his future. And say he were to get promoted to Ferrari, they need a replacement. Maybe that's where Jack Crawford, somebody I'd actually not considered there with the Cadillac move. He could potentially go to Cadillac, but maybe he could also make the move to Haas, because I don't think that seat's going to open up at Aston Martin. And no disrespect to Jack Crawford, but I can't see Aston Martin putting him in as Fernando Alonso's replacement, assuming that Lance Stroll is going to continue for forevermore at that team. That's not the kind of they don't want to be putting in a rookie driver to replace a two-time world champion, particularly if they're competitive. So maybe Haas is an opening for somebody like that, or maybe even Colton Herta if Cadillac don't have the space for him there because they're sticking with their drivers. The other one for Haas is, as I just mentioned, Yuki Tsunoda as well. And there's obviously Toyota a growing influence with the team. They're going to be title sponsors in 2026. And there's an obvious Japanese link there. For that to happen, Tsunoda's obviously a Honda-backed driver, so he'd have to cut ties with Honda, which would be a surprising move in many ways. But if it was to get him back into the F1 picture and into he wants to return full time, I think it's fair to say that his Red Bull days are over, unless something unforeseen happens and he steps in as in his reserve role. But realistically, he's going to be having to look outside of the Red Bull family for a future drive, and maybe there's an option that I'm sure Toyota would love to have a Japanese driver, and there's no better Japanese driver at the moment than Yuki Tsunoda. He's the most prominent, and he has the F1 experience. So potentially, that could be an option for Haas, that maybe Tsunoda slots in there, or they look at a younger driver, a Jack Crawford, or a Colton Herta if they want to go down the American driver approach, or maybe Valtteri Bottas becomes available, or Sergio Perez.
Yeah, I think nationality has never really been Haas's priority either. They've always just wanted an interesting or a solid pair of hands. But Jordan, just before we started recording, I mean, you mentioned an interesting prospect, of course, with rally driver turn open wheel racer Kalle Rovanperä. I mean, there's a Toyota link up there. Is that potentially an entrance into Formula One, and Haas could potentially eye someone like him up?
Well, this is only brought to me because my colleague I work with in MotoGP, Alex, he's a massive rally fan, and yeah, he says if it really works out where Rovanperä goes and actually performs well in the open wheel sort of classes, there's a chance that this could happen. Like, just in a full sort of fantasy land. Who knows? I mean, he's young enough.
Who knows? Yeah.
And he's so Finnish as well. Like, I love how they are. Like, F1 always needs a couple of fins in there, I always think, just for the...
Absolutely.
Just for the dryness and how they are, especially. But he's a really talented guy, and he's made it clear that he wants to go to F1. That's his dream. I mean, there could be that link. Who knows? But an awful lot of steps need to go in the right direction for him to get there eventually to F1.
Yeah, absolutely. And just really quickly before we finish up, I just want to touch on Lewis Arvid Lindblad. Obviously, he is kind of Helmut Marko's last big signing into the Red Bull family, but I think that whole landscape is going to change massively next year between those two teams without Helmut Marko driving that essential driver development program. It'll all come down to the team principals on both of those teams, really, I think, at this point, and maybe some of upper Red Bull management will have a say in those things. But I mean, Arvid Lindblad is kind of now potentially the de facto young driver that is one that we think would be to build up to the Red Bull seat. It's very early to be saying that, but obviously he's a lot more promising. But I mean, Liam Lawson, safe pair of hands, but I think actually potentially what's more interesting is what's going to happen with that second team as opposed to the Red Bull team. What do you think the driver lineup looks like for Racing Bulls, or whatever name they have, in the next 2 years?
Yeah, I think the Helmut Marko leaving aspect is interesting, because I think ultimately that will change how the whole situation viewed, and I think there'll be less pressure on not only Hajar at Red Bull, but also Lindblad, and there kind of needs to be to a certain extent, because Red Bull don't have this never-ending supply of young drivers, and Lindblad's, in some ways you could say, potentially been fast-tracked, because he could have had a couple of years in F2 before bringing him through, and there's a little bit of a gap now in terms of their next young driver, so they kind of don't want to burn through these drivers too quickly and then not have anyone to come through and replace them. I think they'll both get given time, to be honest. I just don't see, it's a very different approach with Laura Mekias, and with the kind of spotlight that Helmut Marko puts on the drivers gone, I just think Red Bull will give both Hajar and Lindblad more time. And particularly in Lindblad's case, he needs the time. He needs that chance to bed in F1. And I think, alongside Liam Lawson, it's, as you say, a safe pair of hands and a known reliable benchmark for Red Bull to kind of compare Lindblad to. He's driven for both teams, so they know exactly, they've got all the data, they know exactly what Lawson can do, and that will be the perfect way for them to kind of test out Lindblad and see exactly what he's made of. And we obviously saw Hajar probably exceeding expectations in many ways, in terms of how quickly he proved himself and how quickly he's ultimately ended up in the Red Bull seat. But I think Red Bull will be they'll be hoping that this all works out and that they don't need to have the question mark of who needs replacing, because they're kind of running out of drivers to do so. So I think in an ideal world for Red Bull, it won't be a factor for them, and both drivers will do a good enough job to continue. I think at Racing Bulls, I see, unless a disaster happens, which I don't imagine Lindblad's going to have an absolutely terrible rookie season. I would think they'd keep the same driver lineup for 2027 and stick with Lawson. And I think Lawson wants to stick around in F1. Obviously, he's I'm sure he would love to be back at a top team. Whether he's going to get that chance or not, I kind of doubt it now, and certainly not going to get back in at Red Bull. So is he kind of just almost becoming the Yuki Tsunoda type figure, where he's just used as that?
He is kind of falling into that category, isn't he? Or the Kvyat before
Yeah.
kind of.
I just don't really see him. He's not really done enough to kind of warrant a move to a big team elsewhere. It's going to be hard for him to do that where he is, and I don't think he's going to find himself back at Red Bull anytime soon. So as long as he's happy to continue doing that at Racing Bulls and kind of becoming the team leader there, particularly if they're more competitive next year, he might find himself on the podium at times. So I think Lawson and Lindblad is the kind of safe, sensible option. The ideal scenario for 2027 for Red Bull would be to have Verstappen and Hajar still no change, basically keep all four in the same seats. I think would be their ideal scenario. I'm not sure that will happen, but I know.
Yeah, it feels silly for us to kind of try to even pin down any sort of driver lineup with Red Bull, just the way things have gone. Even in the static years, it's always Red Bull and Racing Bulls that have some changes in those two teams. Well, that's it for us this week. We are just weeks away from the first car launch of 2026. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and head over to crash.net to stay up to date with all the latest Formula One news and updates. And until next time, thanks for listening.